The day my father-in-law called me a charity case in front of 40 people, I was wearing a blazer I'd bought at a Goodwill in Midtown for $11. He didn't know that. He didn't know a lot of things about me. I remember the exact moment. It was the quarterly dinner for Hargrove Capital Partners, my husband's family firm, the one his father, Edmund, had built from a regional insurance brokerage into a mid-size private equity shop over 30 years. They held these dinners at the same steakhouse in downtown Charlotte every quarter, the kind of place with leather booths and dim lighting and a wine list that started at $90 a bottle. My husband Thomas had been working there since he graduated from Wake Forest. That was the deal. You graduate, you join the firm, you learn from Edmund. That was always the deal. I was not part of the deal. I'd met Thomas in our junior year at UNC. I was on a partial academic scholarship studying finance, working 20 hours a week at a campus coffee shop to cover the rest. He was the son of Edmund Hargrove. You can imagine how that first Thanksgiving went. Edmund never said anything directly cruel to my face, not in those early years. He was too polished for that. But he had a way of looking at me that said everything, like I was a foreign object that had attached itself to his son, like I was something Thomas would eventually work out of his system. When we got engaged, Edmund pulled Thomas aside at Christmas. I wasn't supposed to hear. The walls in that house were thin, and Edmund's voice carried. She has no family money, no connections, no foundation, he said. You're not marrying a partner, Thomas. You're adopting a liability. Thomas defended me. He always defended me. But he still took the job at the firm. He still showed up every Monday morning and sat across from his father and nodded along in meetings, and I loved him for trying to hold both things at once, but I also understood, even then, that there was a version of his life his father had already written, and I was not in it. I got a job at a mid-size asset management firm in Charlotte 6 months after we married. Nothing glamorous. Junior analyst, lots of spreadsheets, lots of late nights. Edmund found out and made a comment at Sunday dinner about how it was sweet that I was keeping busy. Thomas's mother Helen laughed politely. I smiled and asked for the potatoes. What Edmund didn't know, what I never told anyone in that family, was that I had been building something on the side since I was 24 years old. It started with my grandfather's inheritance. He died the year I graduated college and left me $43,000. Not a fortune, but enough. My own father had died when I was 16, and my mother worked 2 jobs to keep us in our apartment in Raleigh. Nobody in my family had ever had $43,000 sitting in an account before. I didn't touch it for a year. I just let it sit there while I read everything I could get my hands on about real estate investment, about distressed assets, about the kind of small commercial properties that institutional money ignores because the numbers are too small to be interesting. Then I bought a duplex in Durham for $38,000 at a tax lien auction. By the time I married Thomas, I had 4 units. By the time Edmund made his comment about me being a liability, I had 11. Not a massive portfolio, not the kind of thing that makes headlines, but mine, fully mine, held under an LLC I'd formed in my maiden name, Kendall Properties, LLC. Not because I was hiding it from Thomas. Thomas knew. But because I had learned early that when people know what you have, they start treating you differently. And I wasn't ready for that. I wanted to keep building quietly. I wanted to be sure of what I was doing before anyone else got to have an opinion about it. Edmund had no idea. For 6 years, he introduced me at firm events as Thomas's wife, never by my name if he could avoid it. At one client dinner, he actually said, "And this is Thomas's lovely wife? She's in finance, aren't you, sweetheart?" With the same tone you'd use to describe a child's macaroni art project. I was managing a $4.2 million residential portfolio at that point, but I smiled and said yes. The breaking point came in March of last year. Edmund had been trying to close a deal for months, a commercial property acquisition in South End, the neighborhood just below Uptown Charlotte that had been exploding with development, a mixed-use building. 3 retail units on the ground floor, 12 apartments above. The asking price was $2.8 million. Edmund's firm had a buyer lined up, a local developer named Powell, and Edmund was acting as the intermediary, which would have been a significant fee for Hargrove Capital. The deal kept stalling. The seller kept pulling back. Edmund was frustrated. He'd been talking about it at every family dinner for 3 months. What he didn't know, because he had never once in 6 years asked me a single substantive question about my work, was that I knew the building. I knew it because I had made an offer on it 14 months earlier through a broker. It had fallen through because the seller, an older man named George who'd owned it since the 80s, was not in a rush. He wanted the right buyer. He turned down 2 institutional offers already because he didn't like the developer's plans to gut the residential units. I'd stayed in touch with his broker loosely just to keep the door open. When Edmund mentioned the seller's name at dinner in January, "George is being impossible. I don't understand what he wants." I excused myself to use the restroom and stood in the hallway for a minute just breathing. I called George's broker the next morning. We had a conversation. It turned out George had heard of Edmund's buyer, Powell, and didn't like his reputation for displacing long-term tenants. George didn't want to sell to Powell. He was only still at the table because his attorney had advised him to at least hear the full offer. I made a competing offer 3 days later. I didn't tell Thomas until the night before the deal closed. I'd been carrying it alone for 8 weeks, which was not fair to him, and I knew it. But I also knew that Thomas was not good at keeping things from his father, and I couldn't risk it getting back to Edmund before the ink was dry. When I told Thomas, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How long have you been doing this?" And I showed him the portfolio spreadsheet for the first time. All of it, every property, every LLC, every number. He didn't say anything for almost 2 minutes. Then he said, "Okay. Okay?" And then, "My father is going to lose his mind." Edmund found out on a Wednesday afternoon when his broker called to tell him the South End property had sold to another buyer and the deal was dead. Powell was furious. Edmund called Thomas immediately. Thomas told him to come to our house that evening. He arrived at 6:30 with his attorney, a man named Garrett who had been with the firm for years. Helen came too, which surprised me. She sat on the far end of our living room couch and didn't make eye contact with anyone. Edmund did not sit down. He stood in the middle of our living room, and he pointed at me and he said, "Did you buy that building?" I said yes. He said, "You went behind my back. You torpedoed a deal I'd been working on for 4 months. You cost this family hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees and you did it deliberately." His voice was very controlled, which was somehow worse than if he'd been yelling. "I have spent years watching you leech off my son's career, sit at our table, take from this family, and this is what you do with it." I didn't say anything. "She doesn't even have the money to buy a building like that," he said, turning to Thomas like I wasn't in the room. "Where did this money come from, Thomas? Did you give it to her? Is this from the firm?" Thomas said, "The money is hers, Dad. It's been hers for years." Edmund looked at me again. "You're a junior analyst at a mid-tier firm. You make $60-something thousand a year. Don't insult my intelligence." Garrett, his attorney, had a folder open on his lap. He said there might be grounds for tortious interference, that I had deliberately disrupted a business relationship Edmund had a reasonable expectation of completing. I let him finish. Then I went to our home office and came back with a manila folder of my own. I put it on the coffee table and I said, "Before Garrett files anything, you should probably look at that." Edmund didn't move. Garrett leaned forward and opened it. Inside was the full corporate filing for Kendall Properties, LLC, going back 9 years, the property list, the acquisition history, the tax records, the current valuation summary, which my accountant had prepared for a refinancing application the previous fall, $6.1 million in assets, net of debt. There was also a copy of the purchase agreement for the South End building, fully executed. And behind that, a single sheet of paper, a letter from George's broker stating that his client had declined to complete the sale to Powell Development based on concerns about the buyer's development practices and had independently selected an alternative buyer. I hadn't torpedoed Edmund's deal. George had already been looking for a way out. I had simply been the way out he chose. Garrett read in silence for about 90 seconds. Then he closed the folder very carefully and set it back on the table. Edmund looked at it. He looked at Thomas. He said, "You knew about this?" Thomas said. "Not all of it. Not until last week. She's been running a real estate business for 9 years and you didn't know. She built it herself. Before we were married." The room was very quiet. Edmund turned back to me. I could see him recalculating. which was the most satisfying thing I'd ever watched him do. He was a man who had always known the landscape, always known where the money was and who had it. He had looked at me for 6 years and seen nothing worth cataloging. He said, slowly, "How much is the South End property worth?" I said, "I paid $2.65 million. Current assessed value puts it around 3.1, maybe 3.2 with the South End trajectory. I expect to refinance within 18 months and pull out the equity for the next acquisition." He didn't say anything. I said, "I didn't buy it to hurt you. I bought it because it was a good deal and I'd been watching it for over a year and George wanted to sell to someone who would keep the residential units intact. That's in the purchase agreement, a deed restriction. The 12 apartments stay residential for a minimum of 15 years. Edmund looked at Garrett. Garrett said, "There's no viable tortious interference claim here. The seller exercised his right to choose his buyer. There was no existing contract between Hargrove Capital and the seller, only a letter of intent that was non-binding." Edmund said, "I'm aware of what a letter of intent is, Garrett." The silence after that was a different kind of silence. Not the hostile kind from before. The kind that comes after a man has run out of the words he came in with. Helen spoke for the first time. She was still looking at the far wall. She said, quietly, "Edmund, sit down." He sat down. I didn't feel victorious. I want to say that, because I think people expect the moment to feel like a movie. Like something swells up and you stand there glowing. It didn't feel like that. It felt like being very tired and very steady at the same time, like I had been holding something heavy for a long time and I'd just set it down and now my arms were empty but also lighter. Thomas reached over and took my hand. Edmund looked at the folder on the table for a long moment. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." It came out flat, like a sentence he was reading off a card, but he said it. I said, "You've been calling me a liability for 6 years, in front of your clients, in front of your clients, in front of your wife, in front of your son." I kept my voice even. "I don't need a real estate deal to prove something to you. I needed you to stop treating me like I was nothing." He didn't respond to that. Garrett packed up his folder and said he'd see himself out. Edmund and Helen left 20 minutes later. At the door, Helen touched my arm briefly and said, "I'm sorry." Just those 2 words. I believed her. That night, after they left, Thomas and I sat on the back porch for a long time without talking. The neighbors down the street had a dog that kept barking at something in the dark. The air smelled like cut grass. Thomas said, "I should have pushed back more. Over the years, I should have pushed back harder." I said, "You did what you could. It wasn't enough." I didn't argue with him. It wasn't enough. But it was also not the whole story, and we both knew it. The South End building closed escrow 4 weeks later. I drove by it on a Saturday morning before the handoff, parked across the street, and just looked at it for a while. It's a brick building from 1974, not beautiful exactly, but solid. The retail units face the street and the light hits them well in the morning. 3 of the 12 apartments still had the original tenants, people who'd been there for years. That was the thing I kept coming back to when Edmund talked about the deal like it was just a number on a page. There were people in that building. George knew that. I knew that. Pal didn't seem to. Edmund and I have a different relationship now. Not warm. Not the kind of thing you'd write a greeting card about. But honest, in a way it never was before. He asked me at the next quarterly dinner, different restaurant, his choice, whether I'd ever consider bringing a deal to him for co-investment. I said I'd think about it. I haven't yet. Maybe someday. What I know is this: I spent 6 years making myself smaller in rooms where I should have taken up space. Not because I was afraid of Edmund exactly, but because I had learned, growing up the way I did, that the safest thing was to stay quiet and keep building and let the work speak when the time was right. The time was right. I am not my father-in-law's definition of success. I am not the version of a daughter-in-law he would have drafted if he'd had the chance. I never went to a school with his family's name on a building. I never had a trust fund or a connection or a soft landing. I had $43 from a grandfather who smelled like coffee and Old Spice and believed without any evidence that I was going to be fine. He was right. I still think about that folder on the coffee table sometimes. Not the numbers inside it. the moment Edmund reached for it and stopped. Like some part of him already knew that whatever was in there was going to cost him something he couldn't get back. People like Edmund operate on a simple assumption that the world has already sorted everyone into their correct place, and his job is just to read the rankings. He looked at me and saw a woman from Raleigh with a scholarship and a part-time job, and he decided that was the whole story. He never asked a follow-up question, not once in 6 years. That's not arrogance exactly, it's a failure of curiosity. And curiosity, I've come to believe, is the beginning of almost every good thing. I didn't build what I built to prove Edmund wrong. I want to be clear about that, because I think the easy version of this story is a revenge story, and it isn't quite that. I built it because my grandfather left me $43,000 and a quiet belief that I was capable of more than my circumstances suggested. I built it because my mother worked 2 jobs and never complained, and somewhere in watching her I learned that the most dignified thing a person can do is put their head down and make something real. I built it because I was 24 years old and I had a small window and I didn't want to waste it waiting for someone to invite me to the table. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell stories like this. The years before the folder, the Saturday mornings, reading about tax lien auctions, when I could have been sleeping in. The spreadsheets I kept on a laptop I bought refurbished. The duplex in Durham that needed a new water heater 3 weeks after closing, and I had to figure out how to pay for it without panicking. There was no dramatic music playing during any of that. It was just me making decisions, trying to be honest with myself about what I knew and what I didn't. What I've learned, the thing I keep coming back to, is that integrity isn't just about being a good person in the obvious moments. It's about the choices you make when no one is watching and nothing is at stake yet. I kept George's tenants in mind when I structured that deed restriction. Not because it helped me financially, because it was the right thing to do and I had the power to do it. Edmund would have called that sentimental. I call it the only kind of success worth having. And then there's the matter of staying steady when someone is trying to make you feel small. Edmund called me a liability in his own living room, in front of his attorney, in front of his son. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I went to the office and came back with paper. Because the strongest position you can ever be in is the one where the facts do the talking and you don't have to. Thomas asked me later if I'd been scared. I told him the truth. I wasn't. I'd been scared years ago when I wasn't sure the work was going to add up to anything. By the time Edmund sat down in our living room, the scared part was long over. That's the thing about building something slowly and honestly over time. By the time anyone tries to take it apart, it's already too solid to move.